Janitors clean floors. Engineers fix vehicles. Kyle Mercer ripped the wrench out of the old man's hand and tossed it across the motor pool floor. The sound echoed through the massive garage, while a dozen young engineers laughed beside the dead Humvee. Walter Hayes didn't react. The 78-year-old janitor simply bent down, picked up the wrench slowly, and looked at the Humvee again. The vehicle sat dead under the fluorescent lights, hood open, cables everywhere, laptops glowing green with diagnostics that claimed nothing was wrong. But the engine still wouldn't start. Colonel Callahan was arriving in less than 20 minutes for the memorial convoy inspection, and panic was beginning to spread across the base. "We've checked everything," Kyle snapped. "Battery, ignition, ECU, fuel pressure. It's dead." Walter stepped closer to the engine bay. His faded gray coveralls smelled faintly of oil and floor cleaner. "No," he said quietly. "She's scared." The entire garage burst into laughter. One mechanic nearly dropped his tablet. "Did the janitor just say the Humvee has feelings?" Kyle smirked and shoved a mop bucket with his boot, sending dirty water splashing across the concrete near Walter's feet. But the old man wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at a tiny vibration near the firewall. His pale blue eyes narrowed. Then he heard it, a faint metallic tick beneath the starter housing. And suddenly the garage disappeared. Desert rain hammered against a Humvee windshield. Tracer fire ripped across black sand. Young soldiers screamed over the radio while 23-year-old Sergeant Walter Hayes crawled beneath a burning convoy truck with blood running down his sleeves. He could still smell diesel and cordite. He could still hear the rotor wash overhead. The memory snapped away as Walter touched the frame of the dead Humvee. "Ground strap," he whispered. "Burned from the inside." Kyle rolled his eyes. "That's impossible." Walter reached into an old leather pouch hanging from his belt and pulled out a worn strip of braided copper wire. Airman Ethan Brooks stared at him in silence. Then his face changed. His eyes locked onto faded lettering stamped inside Walter's pouch. "Ridge Runner." Ethan grabbed his phone and stepped away fast. "Sir," he whispered into the line. "I think the janitor down here used to be Sergeant Hayes." There was dead silence. Then a cold voice answered, "Don't let anyone touch him. I'm coming myself." 30 seconds later, black SUVs screamed toward the motor pool while Walter quietly slid beneath the Humvee alone. You ever seen a Humvee refuse to start because it remembers war? The question drifted through the motor pool in a low, gravelly rasp that barely rose above the hum of fluorescent lights. Nobody answered. Then the laughter started. Kyle Mercer leaned against the open engine bay of the dead Humvee with his arms crossed, a smirk stretching across his face. At 27 years old, he was the youngest lead engineer on Fort Ridgeline Base, proud of his spotless uniform and the expensive diagnostic tablet glowing green in his hands. Around him, half a dozen mechanics stood beneath the steel rafters of the garage, while the smell of diesel fuel and overheated wiring hung heavy in the humid Texas air. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all week," Kyle said. "Hey, somebody tell the janitor we fix vehicles with software now, not ghost stories." More laughter rolled across the concrete floor. Near the rear tire of the Humvee stood Walter Hayes, 78 years old. Thin frame, white hair cropped short against a deeply lined face weathered by decades of desert wind and machine oil. His faded gray maintenance coveralls hung loose on his shoulders, and a yellow mop bucket sat quietly beside him like an insult nobody needed to explain. Walter said nothing. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the Humvee. The vehicle looked tired. Dust coated the hood. The olive drab paint was scratched near the passenger door. The engine compartment sat open beneath the harsh lights while cables and tools cluttered the floor around it. Every test showed the same thing. Battery healthy. Ignition functioning. Fuel pressure normal. No faults in the ECU. Yet every time they tried to start it, the engine coughed once and died like something deep inside it refused to wake up. Kyle shook his head and slammed the hood halfway closed. "Colonel Callahan is arriving in 45 minutes for the memorial convoy inspection," he snapped. "And if this junk pile doesn't move, every one of us is going to look like idiots." One of the younger mechanics pointed toward Walter. "Maybe Grandpa here can fix it with a broom handle." The group burst into laughter again. Walter slowly stepped closer to the Humvee. The old leather soles of his boots scraped softly against the concrete. He reached out and rested his weathered hand against the front fender. For a moment, The entire garage seemed to quiet around him. Cal noticed it and rolled his eyes. "Don't touch it," he warned sharply. Walter ignored him. His fingertips traced the metal lightly. Then his expression changed. Just slightly. Like a man hearing a distant sound nobody else could hear. "Starter isn't the problem," he murmured. Cal laughed again. "Oh, really? And what exactly does the janitor think it is?" Walter's eyes stayed on the engine. Something underneath is scared to carry power anymore. Silence flickered across the garage for half a heartbeat before the mocking returned louder than before. But Walter no longer heard them. Because beneath the smell of hot oil and floor cleaner, another scent had suddenly returned to him. Burnt sand, rain on steel, and smoke rolling across a convoy road 30 years earlier. The laughter inside the motor pool slowly faded, but the tension did not. It hung beneath the fluorescent lights like heat trapped under sheet metal. Walter Hayes kept his hand on the Humvee for another second before pulling it away carefully, almost respectfully. Kyle Mercer watched him with growing irritation. "You are still doing it," he said, talking to the truck like it is alive. Walter looked down at the concrete floor where thin streaks of oil reflected the white overhead lights. "Machines remember the people who depended on them," he said quietly, "especially military ones." Kyle scoffed loudly and turned back toward the engine bay. "I have got 6 engineers, 3 diagnostic systems, and 20 years of modern engineering on my side. I think we are beyond superstition." He motioned toward the ignition. "Watch this." One of the mechanics climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The Humvee responded instantly with a rough metallic cough. The engine shook hard once. Then silence swallowed the garage again. No startup. No ignition. Just the faint ticking of cooling metal beneath the hood. Kyle spread his arms dramatically. "See that? Dead." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. He had not watched the engine. He had listened to it. The old man stepped slowly toward the front bumper while the younger mechanics exchanged amused glances behind his back. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled faintly across the Texas sky. Rain was coming. Walter crouched beside the left tire with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered every winter. He leaned closer beneath the chassis and inhaled slowly. Oil, dust, burned insulation, and beneath it all, the faint sharp scent of overheated copper. His expression darkened. Suddenly the motor pool vanished again. The smell of rain turned into wet desert wind sweeping across a convoy route overseas. He was young again. 23. Sand grinding beneath his boots while damaged Humvees sat stranded under a black sky lit only by emergency strobes. Nervous voices crackled through headsets while frightened soldiers waited for engines that refused to turn over. Walter remembered crawling beneath one of the vehicles with freezing rain dripping off his sleeves. He remembered hearing the exact same metallic tick hidden beneath the starter housing, a sound most people would never notice. A sound that meant power was bleeding away before the ignition could hold it. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Walter blinked once and looked back at the dead Humvee in front of him. "Ground connection is failing," he said softly. "Somewhere underneath." Kyle laughed immediately. "Impossible. We scanned the entire electrical system twice." Walter stood slowly. Machines lie when they are scared. The mechanics groaned in annoyance, but Airman Ethan Brooks did not laugh. He was standing near the tool cabinet watching Walter carefully now. Watching the way the old janitor listened instead of looked. Watching the way his eyes tracked the engine vibrations before they even happened. Then Ethan noticed something hanging from Walter's belt. An old leather pouch, worn smooth with age. And stamped faintly into the cracked leather were 2 faded words that made the young airman suddenly stop breathing. Ridge Runner. Ethan Brooks stared at the faded leather pouch hanging from Walter Hayes's belt while the sounds of the motor pool blurred around him. Ridge Runner. The words were almost invisible beneath years of cracked leather and engine grease, but Ethan recognized them instantly. His grandfather had spoken that name only once. Late at night, quietly, like a man remembering ghosts. Ethan felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. Across the garage, Kyle Mercer slammed a diagnostic tablet onto the hood of the Humvee hard enough to rattle the loose tools beside it. "I am done listening to this nonsense," he snapped. "We have wasted almost 2 hours already." Rain began tapping softly against the high windows of the motor pool. The storm outside was moving closer now. Thunder rolled low across the base while the fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. Walter remained calm. He stood beside the Humvee with one weathered hand resting lightly against the front fender, almost like he was listening through the metal itself. The younger mechanics exchanged irritated looks. To them, he was just an old janitor refusing to stay in his lane. Kyle pointed toward the garage doors. "You need to get back to your mop bucket, Walter." The old man looked at him quietly. "You keep trying to force ignition into a system that cannot hold current." Kyle laughed sharply. "And you know this because your magical truck instincts told you?" Walter's pale blue eyes drifted briefly toward the storm outside. "No," he said softly, "because I have heard this exact sound before." His voice carried no anger, no pride, just certainty. That somehow irritated Kyle even more. He climbed into the driver's seat again and turned the ignition hard. The Humvee coughed violently once before falling silent. Then came the sound. Tick, 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 faint, metallic, hidden deep beneath the firewall. Walter closed his eyes for half a second. The sound pulled him backward through time again. Rain hammering steel, convoy lights cutting through darkness. Young soldiers wrapped in ponchos while exhausted engines steamed beneath freezing desert rain. Walter remembered sliding beneath a crippled vehicle with numb hands and a flashlight clenched between his teeth. He remembered hearing that same ticking hidden beneath burned wiring while frightened voices waited around him for an answer. The memory vanished as Ethan suddenly stepped away from the others and pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. He turned his back toward the garage and dialed a number from memory. The line answered immediately. "Office of Colonel Callahan." Ethan swallowed hard while his eyes remained locked on Walter Hayes. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "I think there is someone down here you need to know about." There was a pause. "Who?" Ethan looked again at the faded leather pouch. "Ridge Runner." His throat tightened. "I think the janitor in Motor Pool 3 used to keep convoys alive overseas." Silence swallowed the line completely. Then the voice returned colder than before. "What is his name, Airman?" Ethan looked directly at the old man standing beside the dead Humvee while thunder shook the windows overhead. "Walter Hayes, sir." The silence after Ethan spoke the name felt heavier than the storm outside. Rain hammered harder against the roof of Motor Pool 3 now, the steady drumming echoing through the steel rafters above the dead Humvee. Ethan kept the phone pressed tightly against his ear while his heartbeat thudded in his chest. On the other end of the line, nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then came the sound of a chair scraping sharply across a floor. "Airman," the voice said carefully, colder now, stripped of casual authority. "Describe him." Ethan swallowed. His eyes drifted toward Walter Hayes standing quietly beside the Humvee while fluorescent light reflected off the rainwater near his boots. White male, late 70s, gray maintenance coveralls, thin build, blue eyes. Ethan hesitated. Carries an old leather mechanic pouch stamped Ridge Runner. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Then the voice on the line lowered almost to a whisper. "Do not let anyone disrespect him again. You are done touching military equipment." Walter looked at him calmly. "The problem is underneath the firewall bracket." Kyle laughed loudly and looked around for support from the other mechanics. "You hear that? The janitor magically knows where the fault is without opening diagnostics." One mechanic shook his head. Another muttered something about old men losing their minds. But Walter did not react to any of it. He slowly crouched beside the Humvee again, his knees cracking softly against the concrete floor. His weathered fingers slid beneath the chassis carefully, feeling along the frame rail with practiced certainty. The younger mechanics watched with growing irritation while thunder rattled the garage doors. Walter paused suddenly. His fingertips rested against a small section of cable hidden behind the mounting bracket. Warm. Too warm. Even without power running. His expression tightened almost invisibly. Then another memory surged through him. Darkness. Rain. Convoy lights glowing dim through desert fog. A terrified 19-year-old private kneeling beside a dead transport truck while distant thunder rolled across empty sand. Walter remembered reaching beneath freezing steel with bare hands while frightened voices waited around him for answers he was not sure he could give. He remembered hearing the exact same ticking hidden beneath burned copper insulation. The memory faded slowly this time, lingering like smoke behind his eyes. Walter pulled his hand free and stood carefully. "Ground strap is arcing internally," he said quietly. "Power is bleeding before ignition can hold." Kyle threw his arms into the air. "That is impossible. The system scan would catch that instantly." Walter looked directly at him for the first time. His pale blue eyes remained calm, but something ancient sat behind them now. Computers only read what the machine chooses to say. Before Kyle could answer, headlights suddenly swept across the rain-soaked garage doors outside. Bright. Fast. Multiple vehicles. The mechanics turned instinctively toward the sound as tires hissed against wet pavement beyond the motor pool. Ethan's stomach dropped immediately, because nobody drove onto the maintenance lot that fast unless someone important was angry. The black SUVs came to a violent stop outside Motor Pool 3, headlights slicing through the rain like searchlights across fog. Water sprayed across the pavement while engines idled low and heavy beneath the storm. Every mechanic inside the garage turned toward the doors instinctively. Kyle Mercer frowned. What now? The answer came 3 seconds later. The side door burst open hard enough to rattle the steel frame against the wall. Colonel Richard Callahan stepped inside without slowing down. Tall, broad-shouldered. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his combat jacket while cold air swept into the garage behind him. 2 military police officers followed close behind, but neither spoke. They did not need to. The look on the colonel's face silenced the entire motor pool instantly. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while rain hammered the roof like distant artillery. Colonel Callahan's eyes moved across the room once. Fast, sharp, searching. Then they stopped on Walter Hayes standing beside the dead Humvee. Everything changed. The colonel froze completely. For one strange moment, he no longer looked like the commanding officer of Fort Ridgeline. He looked like a man staring at history itself. Kyle stepped forward awkwardly, trying to recover control of the situation. Sir, we are handling a maintenance issue right now. Colonel Callahan did not even look at him. His eyes remained locked on Walter. Who touched him? The question landed softly, but the weight behind it crushed the room flat. Nobody answered. Kyle blinked in confusion. Sir. The colonel finally turned toward him. His expression was calm now. Too calm. I asked, he said slowly. Who thought it was a good idea to mock Sergeant Walter Hayes in my motor pool? The title hit the mechanics harder than the thunder outside. Sergeant. Several of them exchanged confused looks immediately. Kyle frowned. Wait. Him. Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes quietly. Walter remained completely still beside the Humvee, one weathered hand resting lightly against the fender while rainwater dripped from the edge of the garage roof nearby. The colonel walked toward him slowly now. Respectfully. His boots echoed against the concrete floor. I heard you might be here, he said quietly. Walter gave the faintest shrug. Just cleaning floors, Colonel. A strange expression crossed Callahan's face. Something between disbelief and frustration. You disappeared after Kandahar, he murmured. Half the convoy units on the East Coast still tell stories about Ridge Runner. Kyle looked around in total confusion now. Sir, with respect, he is a janitor. The colonel's eyes snapped toward him instantly. No, he said coldly. He is the reason 32 soldiers made it home during the Black Ridge convoy failure. Silence swallowed the garage whole. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now. Walter looked uncomfortable suddenly, almost tired, like a man who had spent years trying not to be remembered. Callahan turned toward the dead Humvee. You said you found the fault? Walter nodded once. Ground strap behind the firewall bracket. Kyle opened his mouth immediately. Sir, diagnostics already ruled that out. The colonel never looked away from Walter. Then your diagnostics are wrong. Walter slowly knelt beside the Humvee again while every mechanic in the garage watched him now with completely different eyes. Walter Hayes knelt slowly beside the Humvee while the entire motor pool watched in complete silence. The mocking was gone now, replaced by something colder. Uncertainty. Rain hammered against the steel roof overhead, while wind pushed mist through the half-open garage doors. Colonel Callahan stood with his arms behind his back near the front bumper, his sharp eyes fixed entirely on the old mechanic. Nobody else moved. Walter reached into the worn leather pouch hanging from his belt and pulled out a flashlight no bigger than his palm. The aluminum casing was scratched from decades of use. He clicked it on once and slid beneath the Humvee with slow, deliberate movements. Kyle Mercer shifted awkwardly nearby, trying to recover some sense of authority. Sir, he said carefully to the colonel. With respect, there is no way he can diagnose an electrical bleed without a scanner. Colonel Callahan never looked at him. Sergeant Hayes was repairing disabled convoy vehicles before you were born, Mercer. Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. Underneath the Humvee, Walter moved the flashlight beam carefully along the underside of the firewall bracket. His weathered fingers brushed across bolts, wiring harnesses, and steel mounting plates with the familiarity of a man walking through his childhood home in the dark. Then he stopped. There, hidden behind the support bracket, a thin braided ground strap no wider than 2 fingers. The outer insulation looked perfectly normal, but Walter could already smell the truth. Burned copper beneath sealed coating. Slow internal arcing. Invisible unless you knew exactly what failure sounded like. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Once again, memory reached for him. Cold rain. Black desert highway. Convoy lights flickering through fog while exhausted soldiers waited around silent engines. He remembered kneeling under a transport truck with freezing water soaking through his sleeves while another mechanic insisted the diagnostics showed no fault. Walter had ignored the scanner then too, because machines spoke differently under stress. He had learned that long ago. The memory faded beneath the sound of rain striking the roof overhead. Walter reached into his pouch again and removed a short strip of braided copper wire wrapped carefully in cloth. Kyle frowned immediately. That cannot possibly be regulation. Walter's voice drifted softly from beneath the Humvee. Neither is leaving soldiers stranded because a computer missed a dying ground. The mechanics exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan Brooks watched silently near the tool cabinets while thunder rolled outside. Walter loosened the damaged strap carefully with a compact wrench polished smooth from decades of use. The old copper inside crumbled apart the second tension released. Several mechanics stared in disbelief. Even Kyle froze. The outer coating still looked intact. Walter replaced the damaged section with steady hands despite the stiffness in his fingers. Every movement was precise, calm, practiced thousands of times before. Finally, he slid back out from beneath the vehicle and pushed himself upright slowly. Rainwater hissed softly against the pavement outside while the motor pool remained dead silent around him. Walter wiped his hands on an old cloth and nodded once toward the driver's seat. Try it now. Nobody moved at first. Then Colonel Callahan looked directly at Kyle Mercer. Well, Kyle swallowed hard and climbed into the Humvee. Kyle Mercer settled into the driver's seat slowly while every pair of eyes inside motor pool 3 locked onto the dead Humvee. Rain pounded the roof overhead in steady waves, rattling the steel beams above like distant drumfire. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed softly while water dripped from the edges of Colonel Callahan's jacket onto the concrete floor. Walter Hayes stood a few feet from the front bumper with grease still dark across his weathered hands. Calm, silent, waiting. Kyle gripped the ignition key tightly. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty crept across his face. His earlier arrogance had vanished somewhere between the burned copper wire and the colonel calling the old janitor Sergeant Hayes. He looked once toward the diagnostics tablet resting on the passenger seat. All green. Everything still read normal. But the damaged ground strap lying on the floor beside Walter told a different story entirely. Kyle swallowed and turned the key. The motor pool exploded with sound. The Humvee roared to life instantly. Deep, powerful, steady. The engine rumbled through the concrete floor beneath their boots while the entire garage froze in stunned silence. Warm exhaust rolled upward through the rain-chilled air as the headlights flickered on automatically. One mechanic actually stepped backward. Another stared at the engine bay with his mouth slightly open. The impossible machine that had refused every diagnostic command all afternoon now idled perfectly because an old janitor had listened to it breathe. Kyle slowly released the ignition key. His face had gone pale. Walter watched the engine quietly for another moment, listening carefully to the rhythm of the idle. Then he nodded once. There, he murmured softly. She can carry power again. Colonel Callahan exhaled through his nose, almost like a man releasing tension he had carried for years. The engine noise filled the garage while rain hammered the roof overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody joked anymore. Kyle climbed out of the Humvee slowly. How did you know? He asked finally. Walter looked toward the storm outside. Because scared machines sound different. The younger mechanics exchanged uncertain looks. Ethan Brooks stared at Walter with growing awe now. But Colonel Callahan's expression had changed again. The cold anger remained in his eyes, but something deeper sat beneath it now. Respect. He stepped toward the old mechanic carefully. You still carry the same pouch, he said quietly. Walter glanced down at the worn leather hanging from his belt. Some things earn the right to stay. The colonel gave a faint nod. My father told me about you when I was a cadet. Walter's expression tightened slightly. Your father talked too much. A faint smile almost appeared on Callahan's face before fading again. Around them, the mechanics remained frozen beside their expensive equipment and glowing tablets. None of it had mattered. Not today. Thunder rolled across the base again, shaking the windows softly. Walter reached down, picked up the damaged ground strap from the floor, and held the burned copper in his palms silently. His pale blue eyes drifted somewhere far beyond the motor pool now. Somewhere distant. Somewhere only he could still see. Then, very quietly, he spoke words that made Colonel Callahan's face darken instantly. This is not the same failure we had overseas, Walter said. But it came from the same supplier. The colonel's eyes sharpened immediately. What did you just say? Walter looked down at the damaged copper wire again, while the Humvee continued rumbling behind him. I said, he answered softly. Somebody already knew this part would fail. The engine continued rumbling steadily inside Motor Pool 3, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Every mechanic stood frozen beneath the fluorescent lights while rain battered the roof overhead hard enough to shake the windows. Colonel Richard Callahan stared at the damaged ground strap in Walter Hayes's hand as though the small strip of burned copper had suddenly become something dangerous. Same supplier? The colonel repeated quietly. Walter nodded once. His expression remained calm, but his pale blue eyes had drifted far away again. We lost 3 convoy trucks in Kandahar because of hidden electrical failures exactly like this, he said softly. Looked normal on diagnostics. Failed under stress. The room felt colder somehow. Mercer glanced uneasily toward the Humvee idling behind him. You think somebody intentionally made defective parts? Walter looked down at the copper strands carefully. I think somebody cut corners where soldiers trusted them not to. The words settled heavily across the garage. Even the younger mechanics stopped moving completely now. Colonel Callahan stepped closer. Those convoy failures were classified. Walter gave the faintest shrug. Machines do not care about classification. Ethan Brooks watched the old mechanic carefully while thunder rolled across the base outside. The colonel slowly took the damaged ground strap from Walter's hand and examined it beneath the harsh fluorescent light. At first glance, the insulation looked nearly perfect, but inside, the copper strands had darkened and cracked from heat damage hidden beneath the coating. A slow failure. Invisible until the system finally collapsed. Callahan's jaw tightened visibly. This vehicle came out of long-term reserve storage 2 months ago, he murmured. Same replacement supplier contract. Walter nodded again. Then you should inspect every transport vehicle on this base before winter training starts. Silence swallowed the room. The mechanics exchanged nervous looks now. Suddenly, this was no longer about a broken Humvee or an old janitor embarrassing younger engineers. Something much larger sat beneath the surface now. Something uncomfortable. Kyle tried to speak, but his confidence had vanished. Sir, if this is true. The colonel cut him off immediately. If Sergeant Hayes says there is a problem, there is a problem. Walter looked almost tired hearing the rank spoken aloud again. He wiped his hands slowly with an old cloth while rainwater hissed against the pavement outside the garage. I'm not looking for trouble, Colonel. Callahan's expression hardened. Trouble already found us. One of the military police officers near the door suddenly raised a hand to his earpiece. His posture stiffened immediately. Sir, he said carefully. Operations just reported another transport failure near the South Perimeter Road. Every mechanic turned instantly. Colonel Callahan's eyes narrowed. What kind of failure? The officer hesitated. Electrical shutdown during convoy prep. A cold silence spread through the motor pool. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Not surprise. Recognition. The Humvee behind them continued idling steadily now, alive again because one forgotten mechanic had listened to what everyone else ignored. Walter slowly opened his eyes and looked toward the storm outside. It is spreading faster this time, he said quietly. Then his gaze shifted toward the dark rain beyond the open garage doors while distant emergency sirens suddenly echoed somewhere across the base. The emergency sirens echoed across Fort Ridgeline through sheets of cold rain while every person inside Motor Pool 3 stood perfectly still. Colonel Richard Callahan turned sharply toward the military police officer near the garage door. Where? He demanded. South Perimeter Transport Lot, sir, the officer answered immediately. 2 support vehicles lost electrical systems during startup checks. Callahan's face hardened. The storm outside flashed white for a split second as lightning rolled somewhere beyond the runway. Then the colonel looked back toward Walter Hayes. Not at the engineers. Not at the diagnostics equipment. At Walter. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. Walter gave a tired half-smile. "Not as fast as I used to." 10 minutes later, black SUVs cut through rainwater across the base while convoy lights reflected against soaked pavement. Inside the lead vehicle, nobody spoke. Walter sat quietly beside Colonel Callahan with his old leather pouch resting on his lap, while windshield wipers fought against the storm outside. The younger mechanics followed behind in silence, their earlier arrogance completely erased now. As they approached the South Perimeter lot, the flashing hazard lights of disabled transports glowed through the rain like stranded ships at sea. Soldiers moved quickly between the vehicles while maintenance crews stood confused beneath portable floodlights. The moment Walter stepped out of the SUV, conversation stopped. Rain struck his gray coveralls while cold wind whipped across the lot carrying the smell of diesel fuel and wet asphalt. One by one, Walter walked past the disabled vehicles without touching them. He listened, watched, measured. Then he stopped beside the second truck and slowly crouched near the front axle. His fingertips rested briefly against the frame rail. "Same failure," he murmured. Colonel Callahan closed his eyes for a moment. Around them, the younger engineers exchanged uneasy looks beneath the floodlights. Walter stood carefully again and looked across the line of silent transport vehicles stretching through the storm. "Every truck repaired with those replacement straps is going to fail eventually," he said quietly. "Maybe during training. Maybe during transport. Maybe somewhere soldiers cannot afford it." The words settled heavily into the rain-soaked darkness. Kyle Mercer stepped forward slowly now, no arrogance left in his voice. "Why did nobody catch this before?" Walter looked at the disabled convoy vehicles lined up beneath the storm. "Because people stopped listening to the machines." Silence followed. Long, heavy. Then Colonel Callahan turned toward the assembled engineers and soldiers standing under the floodlights. His voice carried clearly through the rain. "Effective immediately, Sergeant Walter Hayes will oversee every inspection on this base." Several soldiers straightened instinctively at the rank. Walter lowered his eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. But Callahan was not finished. He stepped closer and raised his hand slowly to his brow. A full salute. Sharp. Precise. Every soldier nearby froze in surprise before instinct took over. One by one, across the rain-soaked transport lot, hands rose into silent salutes beneath the storm. Walter stood motionless in the center of it all, while water streamed from his gray coveralls and thunder rolled across the dark Texas sky. His pale blue eyes drifted toward the disabled convoy vehicles one last time before he spoke quietly enough that only Colonel Callahan heard him. "Respect is not what keeps soldiers alive," Walter said softly. "Listening does."